It was supposed to be a harmless dinner. That was the word everyone kept using. Harmless. A birthday for my husband's uncle. A cake from the grocery store bakery. Mismatched chairs pulled around the dining table because there were more people than usual. The kind of evening where you show up on time, bring something polite, and leave before the conversation turns sharp. I remember thinking as I set the salad bowl down that I was doing well lately. I'd stuck to our budget that month. I'd skipped buying things I wanted. I felt steady, calm, safe. My mother-in-law poured herself another glass of wine and let it rest in her hand a moment longer than necessary. She sighed slow and practiced like she was about to say something brave. Everyone went quiet in that way people do when they sense a performance coming. She looked at her son, then at me, then back at her glass, swirling it like the answer might appear in the red. Finally she said, "I don't want this to come out wrong. I'm only saying this because I love my son." I felt my stomach tighten but I stayed still. I'd learned that reacting too fast around her only fed whatever she was trying to start. She went on, her voice soft but loud enough for the whole table. "Ever since he married you, his finances have been a mess." There it was, dropped neatly between plates and forks like it belonged there. I waited for someone to laugh, or push back, or at least look confused. No one did. A few people shifted in their seats. Someone cleared their throat. I turned slightly toward my husband, expecting him to say something, anything. He didn't. He stared at his plate like it had personally betrayed him. She kept going. "I don't know what you're doing to him, but he's always stressed about money now. He never used to be like this." She shook her head slowly as if disappointed, as if this was something happening to her, not something she was doing to me. "I just worry," she added, "the way people add salt after they've already ruined the dish." I felt heat rise in my face but I kept my voice even. I said, "We're fine. We budget. We plan. We're actually doing okay." I didn't mention that I paid half our rent when his hours were cut, or that I handled the groceries or that I tracked every dollar like it mattered because it did. I didn't list the ways I'd made myself smaller to keep us stable. I just said we were okay. She smiled at me, thin and pitying. "That's what worries me," she said. "You don't even see it." Around the table the mood shifted. A cousin glanced at her phone. Someone else laughed nervously and said, "Maybe this isn't the time." My mother-in-law waved that off with a little flick of her wrist. "If we can't talk honestly as a family, when can we?" she said, already answering her own question. My husband finally looked up, but only long enough to say, "Mom, it's fine," before dropping his eyes again. He didn't defend me. He didn't contradict her. He let the silence do the work instead. That silence felt heavier than anything she'd said. It told everyone at the table that her version was the safer one. She leaned back in her chair, satisfied now that the idea was planted. She didn't give examples. She didn't mention numbers. Just impressions and worry and love. It was all vague enough to sound reasonable and sharp enough to cut. I sat there, hands folded, nodding like I was listening, like I agreed this was a conversation worth having. As the plates were cleared, she kept circling the same point, never landing anywhere solid. How expensive things were now. How young couples didn't understand sacrifice. How she'd raised her son better than this. Each comment was wrapped in a laugh or a sigh, just enough to seem harmless if you wanted it to be. I watched people nod along, relieved it wasn't about them. I kept thinking about the envelope of receipts in my bag from earlier that week, the groceries I'd bought on sale, the coffee I'd skipped that morning. None of it matched what she implied. I smiled, nodded, and let her finish. And that's when I realized this wasn't concern. It was a cover story. After that dinner, I kept replaying her words in my head, not because they were true, but because they were said out loud. Once something like that is spoken in front of witnesses, it takes on a shape of its own. I lay awake that night staring at the ceiling, running through every choice I'd made since marrying into that family, lining them up against the story she just told about me. The version where I was reckless, careless, some kind of financial parasite. The reality didn't match. I'd paid for half the wedding when her son's savings came up short. I didn't complain. I told myself it was a partnership. When he was laid off for 3 months, I covered the rent without asking questions, dipping into money I'd been setting aside long before he and I ever met. When his car needed repairs, I handed over my savings temporarily, trusting that temporary meant something to both of us. I was always the one making the math work quietly in the background without applause. And yet, to hear her tell it, I was extravagant. She said it like a diagnosis. Extravagant. As if I was out there burning money for sport. I thought about the clearance rack jeans I was wearing at that very dinner. The vacations I'd skipped because we should be responsible this year. The lunches I packed while everyone else ordered out. My version of indulgence was buying store-brand coffee instead of the cheapest one. What bothered me more than her accusation was how easily it slid into place. No one asked her what she meant. No one asked me for numbers. It was easier to accept a familiar villain than to question a comforting narrative. I started to notice things I'd brushed off before. How my husband always seemed short at the end of the month, no matter how good his paycheck looked on paper. How stress followed him home even after raises. How his mother always seemed to know when we were struggling. She was also always there with help. An emergency payment. A card she'd just take care of. It had felt generous at the time, maternal even. Now it felt coordinated. Like she was both diagnosing the illness and prescribing the cure, right in front of an audience. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became that my silence at that table hadn't been accidental. It had been trained. Conditioned by years of subtle pressure and unspoken expectations I never agreed to. I realized I'd been doing a quiet kind of penance for a crime I hadn't committed. I'd been shrinking my needs, softening my voice, accepting blame that didn't belong to me, all to keep the peace. And in that peace, other people had been very comfortable spending money that wasn't theirs. I could feel something shifting, a slow anger replacing the shame I'd been carrying for years. It felt dangerous but also honest, like finally standing upright after years bent over. The thought settled heavy in my chest and refused to move. If I was bankrupting him as she claimed, then the numbers should show it. They always do. And if they didn't, then someone else was draining the account while I was busy apologizing. That night I stopped defending myself and started checking numbers. I didn't know who it would expose yet, but I knew the truth was waiting, patient, unemotional, and impossible to argue with once uncovered. Numbers don't care about excuses, tone, or family politics, and that made them dangerous to liars like her always. I started where any reasonable person would start, with the accounts we shared openly. The checking account. The savings account. The ones I balanced every month like a ritual. Lining up deposits and withdrawals until the numbers clicked into place. Everything looked normal. Bills paid. Groceries accounted for. Rent exactly where it should be. No mysterious transfers. No late fees. If someone were trying to bankrupt us, they were doing a terrible job of it there. For a moment I almost felt foolish for doubting myself. Almost. Then my phone buzzed with a notification I didn't recognize. A credit alert. Not the usual monthly score update, but a specific ping about utilization changing. It listed the last 4 digits of an account I didn't know. I stared at it longer than I should have, waiting for it to make sense on its own. It didn't. I logged into every app one could think of. Nothing matched. I asked my husband casually if he'd opened a new card. He shrugged and said maybe years ago before we were married and changed the subject. That answer stuck with me in the wrong way. Vague. Unfinished. I called the number on the alert the next morning, my voice calm in a way I didn't yet feel. The bank representative asked for verification, then paused. I could hear typing. When she came back, her tone had shifted slightly, professional but alert. She confirmed there was an active credit card in his name. Opened 2 years before our wedding. The balance was high. Very high. I asked where the statements were being sent. She read out an address. It wasn't ours. It was his mother's house. I remember thanking her and hanging up, then sitting there in silence, phone still in my hand, as the pieces started sliding into place on their own. I logged into the account with credentials my husband had apparently never changed. The statement loaded slowly, like it knew it was about to ruin someone's story. Line after line appeared, neat and unapologetic. Thousands of dollars labeled under vague categories. Family expenses. Support. Emergency assistance. Except the dates didn't line up with any emergencies I remembered. The restaurants listed weren't places I'd ever been with him, or at all. Steakhouses across town. Bars I didn't recognize. There were electronics purchases too, big ones from stores I'd never stepped foot in, items that never crossed our threshold. No new TV, No upgraded phone. Just debt. The more I scrolled, the colder I felt. This wasn't one bad month or a moment of panic spending. It was consistent. Careful. Spread out enough to avoid attention but constant enough to drain thousands over time. I checked the payment history. Minimum payments made regularly, often right after his paycheck hit. Money in, money out like a private siphon I'd never agreed to. I called the bank back to make sure I wasn't misreading something, to give someone the chance to tell me there was a mistake. The same representative confirmed everything again. The account was legitimate. The charges were authorized. "Ma'am," she said gently, "this card has been very active." There was no judgment in her voice, just fact, and somehow that hurt more. I didn't confront anyone. Not yet. I took screenshots. I downloaded statements. I made copies and stored them in places no one else had access to. I closed my laptop and went to work like nothing had changed, smiling at coworkers, answering emails, carrying around a secret heavy enough to tilt the day. Every accusation from that dinner replayed in my head, now with numbers attached to them. What unsettled me most wasn't the money itself, but how neatly it explained the gaps I'd been blaming on myself. The unexplained shortages. The constant need to tighten my belt a little more. The way his mother always seemed informed, prepared, ready with commentary about our finances before I'd even finished calculating them. Seeing it laid out like that stripped the emotion away and replaced it with something sharper. This wasn't chaos. It was structure. Someone had decided what was acceptable for me to give up, and what they were entitled to take, without ever asking. I'd been adjusting my life around a drain I didn't know existed, apologizing for pressure I hadn't created. Every skipped purchase suddenly had a shadow. Every lecture from her felt rehearsed now. The silence at that dinner stopped feeling passive and started feeling strategic. Quietly. That night, my husband complained about money again. I listened, nodded, and said nothing. I wasn't angry yet. I was focused. Because this was only the first crack in the ledger, and I could already tell it ran deeper than one hidden card. I thought it was one card. I was wrong. Once I had proof of the first card, it became easier to see what I'd been trained not to look for. I checked his credit report in full, slowly, line by line, the way you read something when you're afraid of what it might say. Another card appeared. Then another. Store cards. Promotional financing. Balance transfers hopping from one account to the next like they were being deliberately kept alive. Each one opened with the same casual confidence, the same assumption that someone else would deal with the consequences later. Buried in the fine print was her name. Cosigner. Authorized user. Emergency contact. She was everywhere, threaded through his credit like a watermark. Every time a balance crept too high, it shifted somewhere new, repackaged as temporary relief. I asked him about it one evening carefully, as if tone alone could determine the truth. He didn't deny it. He just shrugged and said she needed help sometimes. Like that was the end of the conversation. When I pushed gently, he waved it off. It wasn't a big deal. She'd paid some of it back. She always meant to. He said it the way people repeat things they've been taught, not things they've examined. I asked why I hadn't known. He said it would have just stressed me out. That answer landed wrong. Stress was apparently my responsibility to manage, but secrecy was his solution. Meanwhile, my sacrifices had become background noise, expected and invisible. I thought about the dentist appointment I'd postponed for the third time that year because our budget was tight. The dull ache I'd learned to ignore because there was always something more urgent. Then I pulled up one of her statements and saw a weekend spa charge, glowing on the screen like a joke with a punchline only I was meant to understand. Massage. Facial. Resort dining. Paid for on an account tied to my husband's name while I was chewing on the wrong side of my mouth. The pattern was impossible to unsee once it formed. I skipped care. She bought comfort. I delayed needs. She upgraded wants. And when I tried to talk about it, even calmly, even privately, the story flipped. She told him I was controlling, that I was obsessed with money, that I didn't understand family loyalty. She never argued the numbers. She attacked my character instead, and he let her. The next time I asked her directly, she smiled sweetly and said I worried too much. That marriage required trust. That her son had always taken care of her. And it was strange I'd question that now. By the end of it, I was apologizing for asking where tens of thousands of dollars had gone. That's when I understood the web wasn't just financial. It was emotional, built to catch anyone who pulled too hard. Every explanation was designed to keep me quiet and compliant. Every accusation was meant to make me doubt my right to clarity. I'd been framed as extravagant so no one would notice who was actually spending. I stopped bringing it up. I stopped correcting the narrative. Not because I believed it, but because I finally saw how carefully it had been constructed. That's when I stopped asking questions and started preparing a presentation. I built the spreadsheet the way other people build confessionals. Quietly, methodically, with the kind of focus that comes from knowing you won't be believed unless you are precise. Each tab was a month. Each row was a transaction. I didn't dramatize anything. I didn't round numbers up. I copied exactly what was there even when my hand shook. Dates, amounts, merchant names. The truth didn't need help. It just needed space to be seen. Once everything was in one place, patterns emerged that I hadn't noticed when the charges were scattered across accounts. Dining came first. Restaurants I'd never eaten at, sometimes twice in one day, sometimes on nights I knew my husband was supposedly working late. I totaled it slowly, expecting to be wrong. $18,400. I stared at the number longer than I should have, thinking about the frozen meals and packed lunches I'd normalized for myself. Travel was next. Flights booked months in advance. Hotels that charged more per night than our weekly grocery budget. Car rentals. Gas reimbursements. $22,700. None of it aligned with trips we'd taken together. None of it came with photos or stories or souvenirs. Just confirmations and receipts, clean and unapologetic, documenting movement I'd never been part of. Retail and luxury took the longest. Electronics, home goods, clothing stores I'd walked past without going in. $31,000 spread out in amounts small enough to look harmless on their own. I thought about the shoes I'd worn until the soles gave out, the phone I'd kept even after the battery failed. That number felt personal in a way the others didn't. It represented comfort I denied myself so someone else wouldn't have to. Then there were the charges labeled family emergencies. No detail. No explanation. Just a category name that demanded trust. I highlighted them in gray, not because they mattered less, but because they mattered too much to assume. I couldn't verify them. There were no hospital bills. No repairs I could trace. Just money moved under the banner of urgency. The total climbed anyway, quietly unchecked. When I overlaid the timeline, something almost elegant appeared. Every time my mother-in-law had commented on our finances, there was a spike. Every lecture about responsibility matched a surge in spending days earlier. Every warning about stress coincided with another balance transfer. It was choreography. Accusation followed indulgence like clockwork. The more she spent, the louder she worried. I added another sheet, this one just for me. My contributions. Rent covered during layoffs. Wedding expenses. Groceries. Utilities. Savings handed over and never fully returned. The number wasn't theoretical. It was money I'd earned, tracked, and given willingly because I believed in partnership. When I placed it next to the debt, the contrast was unmistakable. I wasn't draining the system. I was propping it up. That was the moment it clicked fully. I wasn't bankrupting him. I was subsidizing her lifestyle. The stress she described so dramatically wasn't caused by me at all. It was the friction between my discipline and her entitlement, with him standing quietly in the middle, benefiting from both. I'd been the invisible buffer, absorbing impact while being blamed for the damage. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes, letting the numbers settle. There was grief there, but also relief. The story I'd been trying to disprove finally collapsed under its own weight. I didn't feel the urge to confront anyone yet. This wasn't about winning an argument. It was about reclaiming reality. And reality, once organized, was devastatingly clear. I saved the file in 3 places. I backed it up twice. I named it something boring, something no one would open by accident. This wasn't revenge yet. It was preparation. Because once you see the math, you can't unsee it. And once you have receipts, this clean silence stops being restraint and starts being strategy. The idea came to me quietly, which is how I knew it was dangerous. No more arguments, no more spreadsheets shoved across the table. No more late-night fights whispered in the dark. This part would be calm, controlled, surgical. That night, I suggested another family dinner the way I always did, casual, almost apologetic, like I was asking permission instead of hosting. Roast chicken. A bottle of wine. Nothing fancy. My mother-in-law accepted immediately, her voice warm with the confidence of someone who believed she had already won. She even suggested dessert. In the days leading up to it, she was radiant. The accusations had slowed, replaced with a smug civility that felt rehearsed. She complimented my cooking in the group chat. She asked if I needed help setting the table. She told my husband how relieved she was that things were finally calming down. Calm, I realized, meant unchallenged. The house became my staging ground. I rearranged the living room under the pretense of making space, shifting the couch just enough to create a clean wall. I tested the projector late at night, adjusting brightness, fixing keystone angles, memorizing the click pattern of the remote. Slide 1. Pause. Slide 2. Pause. I practiced breathing between transitions so my hands wouldn't shake. Every rehearsal was silent. No dramatic speeches. No raised voice. I practiced the tone I would use. Polite, measured, almost bored. The kind of calm that terrifies people more than shouting ever could. I timed myself. I cut unnecessary slides. This wasn't a story anymore. It was an exhibit. My husband noticed none of it. He was distracted, relieved, convinced that the storm had passed. He kissed my forehead when I suggested candles. He thanked me for trying again. When I asked him not to worry about helping that night, he smiled like a man grateful to be spared responsibility. The night before the dinner, I stood alone in the living room and looked at the blank wall. It felt absurd that something so ordinary could become a weapon. I thought about all the dinners before this one, the comments disguised as concern, the side-eye when I paid with my debit card, the sighs about how expensive I was. I reminded myself why this was necessary. On the afternoon of the dinner, I cleaned obsessively. Not because the house needed it, but because my hands needed something to do. I laid out coasters. I chilled the wine. I placed the projector remote exactly where I could reach it without looking. The laptop was already connected, the desktop background an innocuous photo of a beach. As guests started arriving, the room filled with noise and perfume and familiarity. My mother-in-law took her usual seat, posture straight, smile sharpened into place. She surveyed the room like a judge entering a courtroom she already owned. She hugged my husband, patted my arm, and made a comment about how responsible it was of me to host at home instead of eating out. Dinner passed smoothly. Too smoothly. Stories were told. Plates were cleared. Wine glasses refilled. I waited. Timing mattered. Exposure without context is chaos. Exposure with patience is control. Eventually, inevitably, she did it again. With a delicate laugh and a tilt of her head, she said, "You know, if we're being honest, all this spending is exactly why my son's finances are such a mess." I stood, smiled politely, and turned on the projector. The projector hummed softly as the first slide filled the wall, bright and impossible to ignore. Dates and totals, clean and centered, no commentary yet. Just numbers. For a second, no one reacted. My mother-in-law let out a small laugh, the kind people use when they assume something is a joke they're not in on yet. She leaned back in her chair, glass in hand, smiling like she was waiting for a punchline. There wasn't one. I didn't rush. I let the room absorb what it was seeing. A timeline stretching back years. Monthly totals climbing and falling but never stopping. Someone squinted at the wall. Another guest leaned forward slightly, instinctively trying to read more clearly. The laugh on her face stalled, halfway to confusion. She looked at me, then back at the wall, then at her son who was staring straight ahead, jaw tight. I clicked to the next slide. Screenshots filled the space, cropped tightly so nothing could be dismissed as hypothetical. Bank logos. Account numbers partially hidden. Line items highlighted in pale yellow. Restaurants, stores, airlines. Dates stamped neatly beside each charge. This time no one laughed. The room went quiet in a way that felt heavy, like air being pulled out slowly. "This," I said, keeping my voice level, "is where the money went." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't add commentary. I simply spoke like someone presenting weather data. I clicked again. Another statement. More charges. I explained the categories briefly, not defensively, just factually. Dining. Travel. Retail. I mentioned totals the same way you'd mention a temperature. 18,000. 22,000. 31,000. The numbers landed harder because I didn't soften them. Someone near the end of the table whispered, "Oh my God." Not loudly but clearly enough that it rippled. My mother-in-law set her glass down too hard, the sound sharp against the wood. "This is ridiculous," she said finally. "I don't even know what I'm looking at." Clicked again. A slide appeared showing addresses, billing destinations, mailing locations. Her house circled in red, understated but undeniable. The smile was gone now. Her face had gone tight, eyes darting, calculating. She opened her mouth to speak, but I was already moving on. I had learned something important in the weeks leading up to this. Interruptions are a form of control. I wasn't giving her that. I narrated each slide calmly. I pointed out the dates where payments were made right after paychecks cleared. I showed the balance transfers, the way debt jumped accounts to stay alive. I didn't accuse. I didn't speculate. I let the structure speak. The guests followed along, heads turning back and forth between the wall and her face, then to my husband, who hadn't moved. She tried again. "You're twisting things," she said louder now. "Family helps family. Everyone knows that." Her voice cracked on the last word. I clicked again, cutting through it. Another screenshot. Another total. Another month where she'd lectured me about responsibility while spending more than I made in weeks. I could feel the shift happening, subtle but irreversible. People weren't looking at me anymore. They were looking at her. Waiting. Measuring her reaction against the evidence. Someone asked quietly, "Is that real?" I nodded once. "Direct from the bank," I said. No drama. No flourish. She stood up then, chair scraping. "This is inappropriate," she snapped. "You're embarrassing people." I let that sit for half a second, then clicked again. A final slide. A simple comparison. My contributions on one side. The debt on the other. The contrast was brutal in its simplicity. The room absorbed it like a verdict. No one defended her. No one told me to stop. The silence had changed sides. She looked around, searching for an ally, but the faces she found were careful now, distant. The authority she'd carried into the room drained away visibly, replaced by something smaller. Anger, yes, but also fear. She tried one last time to speak over me, to reclaim the narrative, but her voice sounded thin against the glow of the wall. I didn't smile. I didn't apologize. I simply turned off the projector, plunging the room back into its normal light. The evidence had done its work. It didn't need to stay up any longer. People exhaled, like they'd been holding their breath without realizing it. That's when the room turned on her. After the projector clicked off, the room was quiet long enough for someone to break it. My accountant friend, who had come under the pretense of helping with a small tax question, leaned forward and adjusted his glasses. He said nothing dramatic, no judgment, just the kind of measured voice that carries authority without effort. "These totals match the statements," he said. "Every single one. There's no discrepancy." It was simple, concrete, irrefutable. I felt the weight of validation press against the tension in the room. Suddenly I wasn't alone. I wasn't imagining patterns or seeing injustice where none existed. Someone impartial had confirmed it. Then the lawyer, another guest who had been quiet until now, cleared his throat. He stood, fingers interlocked, and spoke in a tone designed to carry. "Legally, this is complicated," he said. "But if these statements are accurate, the co-signer has potential liability. The person whose name is on the accounts isn't off the hook either. This isn't hearsay. This is documentation." I watched my mother-in-law's face pale, and I felt a quiet satisfaction that came from authority siding with truth instead of theatrics. I could see her shift in the chair, the way people do when their stories are suddenly fragile under scrutiny. She tried to redirect, attempting a laugh, a glance at a cousin, a shrug meant to minimize, but the attention had moved. Everyone was leaning toward fact, toward verification. She was suddenly on the defensive, unable to rely on charm or assumed dominance. Then a neighbor, someone who had known my mother-in-law for years, spoke up from across the room. "I remember you telling me about all those free trips your son was paying for," she said. Her voice was calm, steady, a tone that made you feel like she was stating history instead of opinion. You said it like you were proud of how generous he was covering things for you. That's exactly what you've been doing. The room shifted again. The gossip, the side conversations, all eyes turned toward her now. Private boasts, when exposed, become indictments. I didn't say anything. I just let them speak. Let them connect the dots. The careful record-keeping I'd done now had witnesses validating each point. My husband remained silent, shifting in his seat, trying not to meet my eyes. I could tell he was starting to realize the story he'd been told all these years wasn't complete. That the version of events he'd accepted as normal was skewed, molded to protect someone else's ego while blaming me. Finally, someone asked the question no one had said aloud yet. What did you know about this? My husband looked around, jaw tight. I didn't answer for him. Instead, I let the silence do its work. I saw him swallow and straighten, the tension in his shoulders finally giving way. For the first time, he couldn't hide behind her narrative or his own reluctance. The evidence, the witnesses, the numbers, they cornered him into facing reality. My mother-in-law tried one last time to reclaim the room, attempting to interject, redirect, even soften the tone with a joke. But it landed flat. The lawyer, the accountant, the neighbor, they had collectively shifted the weight of authority away from her. What had once been her stage for manipulation was now a gallery of accountability. Everyone could see the lines of control she'd been pulling quietly for years. It was astonishing how fast the dynamic changed once the truth had witnesses. She was no longer untouchable. She wasn't the center of attention. Her power had been quietly dismantled, slide by slide, corroborated fact by fact. And in the corner, my husband looked smaller, more exposed than I had ever seen him. He was part of the story now, forced to reckon with his role, his silence, his choices. And then my husband finally spoke. The moment my husband spoke, the room shifted like a sudden gust of wind. My mother-in-law's composure cracked just enough for everyone to see the edges of it. Questions started spilling out, tentative at first. Fraud, someone whispered. How long has this been happening? Another voice, louder, demanded. Why wasn't this disclosed? Every inquiry was a tiny blow to the careful image she had cultivated for years. Her defenses flared immediately, but the usual charm and theatrics didn't land anymore. She stammered, repeated the word misunderstanding over and over, but the ledger, the slides, the witnesses, none of them could be argued away. Her usual allies at the table paused, uncertain for the first time. The cousins who had always smiled politely at her jokes now frowned. The aunt who nodded along with her stories looked at her, blinking as if she hadn't realized what was being claimed in her name. The air was full of disbelief, and for once it wasn't mine alone to carry. Questions came faster. Is this your account? Are these charges verified? Did you know about this? My husband answered them with a shaky honesty I hadn't heard before. He admitted he'd been aware of some of the charges, that he hadn't stopped them, that he'd deferred because he didn't want to cause conflict. His silence had been a shield for her, and hearing him name it aloud shifted the room's perception of him. No one cheered him. There was no relief. Only the raw, uncomfortable exposure of complicity. The family's loyalties started to fracture visibly. Some relatives looked at her, then at me and back again, as if weighing the truth against years of habit. Voices rose, not in accusation of me, but in incredulity at her actions. She tried to insist it was a misunderstanding again, that she had just helped and didn't mean harm. But every statement she made collided with facts, corroborated by witnesses and the slide deck still glowing faintly in everyone's minds. Authority had shifted. Her status was crumbling, quietly but irreversibly. I felt a calmness settle over me that surprised me. I was still seated, but I could feel the power of the room slowly leaving her. This wasn't a moment for shouting or dramatics. It was a moment for observation. I let the space speak for me. The embarrassment, the disbelief, the subtle shame creeping into the eyes of those who had once nodded along with her. All of it was a testament to the work I'd done, the quiet preparation, the evidence. I had dismantled a narrative she had built over years, and it had been precise, surgical, and undeniable. When the tension peaked, I stood. I walked toward the door with measured steps, deliberately calm. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The glances that followed me were enough to communicate what had just happened. My departure wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It was deliberate. Walking out first left the room with her in the aftermath, facing the consequences alone. I carried my composure like armor, letting her status collapse behind me without interference. Voices rose behind me, a cacophony of debate and confession, questions and accusations, attempts at justification. She tried to regain control, but it was futile. Numbers, witnesses, facts, they didn't bend for charm or rhetoric. Every argument she made was met with skepticism, every deflection recognized as what it was. The facade she had maintained for so long was unraveling in real time. The quiet of my exit was powerful in a way the confrontation never could have been. There was no applause. There was no cheering. Just a room left with its own awareness, forced to confront a truth they had let slide for too long. The moral authority I had silently claimed during the evening now existed in the emptiness I left behind. Everyone could feel it. Even my husband. He followed eventually, but the pace was different. He wasn't the first out the door. He hadn't orchestrated it. I had. By the time the front door closed behind me, the house was still buzzing but differently. The cracks in her image had been exposed for all to see. Allies who had been loyal out of habit were recalibrating. Her voice, once commanding, now sounded defensive, shrill, and unconvincing. I didn't need to watch. I didn't need to celebrate. I had done what mattered. Truth had been presented, and the weight of evidence had shifted the social gravity of the room. The quiet after was louder than the dinner ever was. After that night, everything changed, but quietly. There was no dramatic confrontation afterward, no shouting matches or late-night calls. The shift had already happened in the room, and from there it rippled outward. My husband and I spent weeks untangling the remaining threads of the accounts, confirming what needed closure and what needed distance. Decisions were made. Lines were drawn. And in the end, separation wasn't just necessary, it was inevitable. The divorce papers arrived with the same quiet finality as the click of my projector. No celebration, no victory lap, just clarity. Financially, I was stable. Every dollar I had saved, every careful choice I'd made over the years, now felt like armor. I wasn't scrambling. I wasn't anxious. I was finally aligned with my own resources, free from the obligations someone else had manipulated me into accepting. The burden of someone else's entitlement no longer rested on my shoulders. Budgeting felt normal again. Saving felt normal again. Even small indulgences, a lunch out, a haircut, a coffee, felt like statements of autonomy, subtle and unremarkable to anyone watching, but meaningful to me. Her isolation followed naturally. Invitations stopped. Casual phone calls dwindled. People who had once smiled and nodded now looked past her, or avoided the topic entirely. The authority she wielded so effortlessly dissolved when the proof was public and corroborated. She was left with herself, her justifications echoing in empty rooms. It was not revenge. It was consequence. And consequence has a way of being quieter than spectacle but heavier. I didn't gloat. I didn't post about it. The moral closure didn't require witnesses. I carried it in the way I walked through the day, in the way I spent my money, in the calmness of my evenings. The house felt lighter, the air easier to breathe, because the quiet truth had been restored. The pattern of entitlement and accusation had ended. The story she'd written about me no longer mattered, because I had rewritten my own. Sometimes when I think back to that projector, to the spreadsheets, to the faces around the table, I can still feel the weight of disbelief, the slow pivot of loyalty in the room. It reminds me how easily appearances can manipulate perception, and how power can hide behind concern, love, or maternal advice. But numbers don't lie. Receipts don't bend. Facts stand quiet and unyielding, waiting to be noticed. If someone says you're ruining their life, check the receipts. You might be funding it.